Brandon was in a good mood all day at work. The man hadn't experienced such a spiritual uplift in a long time, and it inspired him and made him smile all the time. His upbeat disposition was due to the fact that he was about to close a huge deal on a luxurious mansion. That night, the man kept looking at his watch, which seemed to have stopped or to be moving extremely slowly. When the workday was done, Brandon rushed to the meeting with the owner of the property he wanted to buy. Kelly, my girlfriend, will be overjoyed. It's a luxurious home at an affordable price. It's a gift rather than a purchase. In anticipation of the great deal, the man thought joyfully. Henry, the house's owner, was holding the purchase documents and was already waiting for Brandon on the terrace. Finally, I was beginning to worry, the man said as he extended his hand to Brandon. I apologize for staying late at work. I couldn't help but worry about one thing all this time. Why is this house's price 3 times lower than the market price? Brandon inquired as he shook Henry's hand. Henry appeared confused for a moment before saying, I'm going to answer your question. It is not a secret. I've decided to relocate to another city, so I no longer require this residence. I'd like to sell it as soon as possible, but if there's anything you don't like about it, I'm confident I can find another buyer. Brandon, of course, didn't want to lose the house, so he gladly agreed to the deal. Brandon didn't think twice about signing the documents for the house that Henry provided because they didn't raise any red flags. The following day, he transferred the entire amount owed to the mansion's owner and considered the transaction completed. Brandon went to the supermarket to celebrate the purchase of the valuable real estate, where he purchased a bottle of good wine, a box of chocolates, and some other treats that his girlfriend Kelly adored. After entering the house, the man gazed around the spacious living room, which featured a fireplace and a massive chandelier over his head. Finally, I have my own place to live. I was 35 years old and still slept in cheap motels. Now I can consider having children. It's fine if Kelly does not want to be a mother. Brandon thought as he moved from room to room, she'll change her mind as soon as she sees this house. He grew fonder of the house as he spent more time there. Finally, he arrived at the second floor where, like the first, renovations had recently been completed. Henry was passing by a half-open bedroom when he heard a muffled groan. The man froze in surprise before carefully entering the house. Brandon almost passed out from what he saw in the bedroom. The floor of the bedroom was occupied by an emaciated and pale woman. She was dressed in pajamas, giving the impression that she lived in this house. Wow, that is certainly unexpected. What other secrets are hidden within these mansions' walls? Brandon thought as he lifted the girl off the floor and placed her on the bed. Now I know why the price was so low. The stranger asked, "Who are you and what are you doing in my house?" "Sorry, but this is now my home. It was sold to me by Henry Johnson." Brandon replied, wrapping the blanket around the girl. "Oh wow, my dirtbag husband has already sold the house and me with it," said the woman, her eyes welling up. When Brandon heard this, he turned pale and realized he had most likely been duped. Nonetheless, the man was unable to fully comprehend what had occurred. "But how did your name end up on the sales documents?" Brandon inquired, surprised. In response, the woman only smiled and raised her hands. Despite the fact that the duped man had already deduced that the cunning businessman had simply forged his wife's signature in order to sell the house as soon as possible. "Please excuse me, may I assist you in any way?" Brandon inquired, deciding to postpone the awkward conversation. "Yes, I'd appreciate it if you could bring me a glass of water," the woman replied, timidly looking at the new owner of the house. Brandon's heart was filled with pity when he saw the woman's eyes filled with unspeakable pain and despair. The former owner of the house took a sip from the glass of water brought to her by the man. Then she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She burst into tears. The woman was openly crying, sobbing loudly, trying to let go of the enormous stress caused by the latest news. The sobbing stranger, unbeknownst to herself, told Brandon her story. The woman's name was Mary, and she was the wife of Henry Johnson, the man who had sold this house to Brandon in such a devious manner. After the young couple had been married for 2 years, the unfortunate woman was diagnosed with cancer. At first, Henry did everything he could to assist his wife. He took her to medical facilities and gave her all of her medications. Mary's oncologists were all in agreement that she had a very good chance of recovery. However, she needed an expensive surgery, which was a problem because her husband was more afraid of losing money than anything else. Instead of assisting his wife, the man accepted that she was gravely ill and eventually lost faith in her recovery. Henry locked her in his house and returned to work as if nothing had happened. Mary still had her mother, but she had just married for the second time. Olivia Hudson's new husband was 10 years her junior, so she felt loved and young all over again, and she devoted all of her love and tenderness to her beloved new husband. When Mary's stepfather was offered a good job in another city, her mother moved with her husband without hesitation. Olivia and Charles were said to have had a child, which meant Mary now had a younger brother. Recognizing that her mother was preoccupied with her new life, the unfortunate woman realized she had no one to turn to for assistance, so she shut herself away from the world in the second-floor bedroom and prepared to die. Furthermore, Henry had long since buried his wife in his mind and quickly found a girlfriend, with whom he devised a plan to sell the house. Mary was left with no choice but to cry out of pain, both physical and emotional, and feeling unwanted and abandoned by both her mother and her husband. After hearing the sick woman's shocking story, Brandon immediately called the cunning businessman, Henry, and demanded an explanation. He accused the previous owner of the mansion of fraud, but Henry proved to be a difficult nut to crack. He was already prepared with an answer. Is there anything you dislike? The house is priced at least 3 times below market value. The woman in the bedroom will die soon, so you won't have to deal with her. Henry hung up the phone indifferently. Brandon had the impression that he was having a bad dream for a brief moment, and that the nightmare would end as soon as he opened his eyes. But no matter how hard he rubbed his eyes, the pale woman on the bed didn't move. Brandon realized he was now responsible for the house's former owner, and decided to assist her. Furthermore, he did it not only because he felt it was his duty, but also because Mary made him admire her. Brandon was drawn to the woman because, despite having a terminal disease, she fought until the bitter end. Of course, Mary initially refused Brandon's assistance, fearing that she would be judged by the new owner of the house, but after realizing that she had no other options, she changed her mind, especially since her husband Henry had abandoned her and gone on an oceanside vacation with his new girlfriend. As a result, when Brandon drove the woman to the hospital, she realized that he was the only one who was willing to help her. Thank you very much. I don't know how to express how grateful I am. When the doctor at the hospital set the date for her surgery, Mary said with tears in her eyes, "You'll thank me when you're better, but for now, concentrate on regaining your strength and not being afraid." Brandon said this while lightly touching the woman's hand. Mary had no idea that the man had sold his car and mortgaged his newly purchased house to pay for her surgery. This was most likely the point at which Brandon realized how much he liked her. Of course, this story led to Brandon's breakup with Kelly, with whom he had a long history of acrimony. After meeting Mary, the man's perspective on life shifted, giving him hope and faith in the future. Brandon was the first person the woman saw in her room after she had surgery. Fortunately, the doctors reported that everything had gone well, and Mary was now awaiting rehabilitation, which was supposed to assist her in returning to a normal life. Brandon, dressed in a suit, smiled happily as he held a large bouquet of white roses. "I didn't come by myself. I brought visitors." Brandon said this while winking at the woman. Mary almost passed out when her mother timidly entered the room. "How are you doing, dear? Please forgive me for leaving you when you needed me the most," Olivia said with tears in her eyes as she approached her daughter. This heartwarming scene did not go unnoticed. Brandon couldn't help but cry, so he chose to give the women some space. He exited the room and ran into Mary's stepfather, who was holding her half-brother in his arms. Brandon understood that the woman's parents had their own lives, and it would be unfair to accuse them of neglecting their daughter. Mary was in the hospital for about a month. When it was time for her to return home, Brandon invited the woman to stay at the house she had owned for a long time, as they felt an irresistible attraction to each other. The young people began living together in the infamous house, where their lives were filled with mutual love and respect. Brandon thanked fate every day for bringing him to that house and allowing him to meet Mary. He was willing to move mountains for her and accomplish the impossible, which he did. A year after they met, the young couple married in a small ceremony that would forever tie their lives together. Brandon not only provided for his wife, but he was also quite successful at work, rising to the position of head of the sales department at one of the city's companies. They decide to celebrate their wedding anniversary one day. Brandon got a reservation at an upscale restaurant. Beautiful flowers, champagne, gourmet dishes, and, of course, candles adorned the dinner. Looking at her husband with loving eyes, Mary felt content and desired. When the couple was about to leave the restaurant after a wonderful meal, they unexpectedly ran into one of the workers at the door. Mary recognized his features. When she looked closer, she recognized the worker as her first husband, Henry, who was desperately trying to hide by pulling a baseball cap over his eyes. Of course, Mary had no doubt that her devious ex-husband had noticed her as well. The woman didn't tell Brandon what she knew, instead hugging him and kissing him passionately. Henry's eyes were filled with tears at the same time. He realized that he had lost everything important to him because of his bitterness and stupidity. After taking his girlfriend to the beach, Henry quickly squandered his savings and the proceeds from the sale of his house. Realizing Henry was now a bankrupt loser, his beautiful girlfriend abandoned him and fled in search of another rich fool. And it wasn't until he had to work hard in the kitchen that he realized what a mistake he had made by abandoning his beloved wife. Unfortunately, there are some things in life that cannot be fixed, and Henry's bankruptcy is a prime example of this.